to your humanity. You are, in fact, the Father's trophy. Not in terms of winning some contest, but in terms of what he has accomplished in your uniqueness, in his uncreated life, such as a painter with his paintings. Except that you are a living, breathing expression of God himself that has been included in God himself and he in you. It is in this that we can know the significance of our identity, the dignity with which God holds it. In many ways, we do the same with our own children. We even allow them to make bad choices that may even be harmful in some ways. To do otherwise would be to trample on their identity as an individual and as a person. Why would we suggest that God should trample on humanity's distinction then? In fact, God's view of humanity far exceeds anything we could ever imagine or think. And in that, we may be permitted to do things that cause even greater harm to ourselves and others. In some ways, our small view of ourselves is exposed in our view of what God is or is not doing on behalf of humanity. Our readiness to sacrifice our distinction or the distinction of others in order to reduce suffering and pain is a clear indication of our small sense of ourselves and our small sense of humanity. In many cases, the institute we call church has adopted a very small view of God, and therefore we have a very small view of ourselves as well as image and likeness bearers of God. Some even suggesting that humanity is totally depraved. Nothing I am suggesting here will take away the pain and suffering, however. But it does begin to give us a context in which to begin to understand why God permits suffering to continue. It does give us a context in which to see God in the midst of it, in the midst of all of it. In fact, your distinction was so worth preserving at all costs. God created Eve with a womb through whom he could rescue humanity. God became human through this womb he created. He has remained human and will always remain human. He even physically died on a cross, in fact. He also became our sin. He became everything that was done to us or perpetrated by us. He was tempted in every way we are tempted. On and on it goes. Your distinction has infinite value to God. He put everything on the line to preserve it. He went all in with humanity. His sovereignty itself was at stake. Do we suppose that the suffering we now experience can come close to the glory God has preserved and is preserving in your distinction? Do we want to suggest that God should throw all that away just to minimize the suffering and pain we experience in the here and now? Our desire to sacrifice our identity and destiny for comfort or a comfortable life speaks volumes. Like Esau, so many are so willing to quickly trade their birthright for a bowl of comfort. Thanks to the institution we call church, most have no clue they even have a birthright born out of the image and likeness of the Godhead. Preserved in the Godhead, in fact, and by the Godhead to be partakers of the divine nature of God himself. Someday, even in the presence of the Father, in the same manner Christ has always enjoyed for eternity past. So please don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, because the suffering and pain is very real, and in many cases unimaginable. I am not ignoring that or even attempting to diminish it in any way. I simply want us to see the bigger picture, to give us a context in which to begin to understand what is going on. To understand the glory of your distinction and the treasure that it is, a one-of-a-kind treasure, in fact, that must leave room for suffering if it means preserving distinction. There are many in this world who actually would gladly sacrifice themselves to preserve even something like the Mona Lisa. God willingly gave himself to preserve the glory of your distinction as a new and unique expression of himself. You are a one-of-a-kind, glorious image and likeness bearer of God, a life bearer that reflects the nature of God himself, just as a painting reflects that of the artist. God even becoming one with the way he chose to express himself through humanity. Just maybe there's more going on than meets the eye when it comes to God's patience in regards to suffering for humanity. While suffering remains part of our human experience, God himself has entered into it, even taking it all upon himself. He took it upon himself, everything we have ever done or ever had done to us. He walks in it with us, inside of us. He is our life, and it's his life that we walk in. It is in this context that God engages with us without diminishing or extinguishing or even violating the glory of our distinction. Not only in the glory that exists in the distinction of our humanity within creation, but now also as new creatures in Christ in the context of humanity's inclusion through adoption in the uncreated spirit life of God. From one glory in creation to another glory in his uncreated spirit life. Distinction intact. Now, I have yet to deal with some of the other reasons why suffering exists and why God does not put it to a stop. So let's not get ahead of ourselves. I have just simply attempted to give us a proper picture of where God is within the context of our suffering and how he has chosen to engage with us relationally, even taking upon himself everything that we have ever experienced, whether it's what we've done or has been done to us. So let us not use this to sweep the issue of suffering away or under the rug in some manner. That would be dishonoring to our humanity and our experience as human beings. Your human experience has great value, no matter what context it exists in. Do not dismiss this. It is uniquely yours. Do not dismiss your life experience, no matter how glorious or painful it might be. Even if our beliefs are wrong, or what we believe about God and ourselves is wrong, your experience as a result of those beliefs, right or wrong, has significant value. It is unique to you. It is part of you, your existence, as a created human being included in the uncreated spirit life of God. God does not wipe the slate clean in terms of who you are. We are overcloaked with the new life of God. The old is not removed. Yes, it passed away and died, but it was also resurrected and is to be overclothed with the new, as Paul tells us. If you happen to be suffering or in pain as you watch this video, what is important is that you are cared for and looked after appropriately. So don't allow these things that I am suggesting here in the early parts of the video to diminish that reality in any way. My only purpose here is to help us put things within a context of reality that helps us when we do come up against these questions in our lives or the lives of others. If what I suggest can be helpful, it will only be such as you are able to integrate it into your experience. I cannot do that for you no matter how much I wish I could. In fact, when I'm suffering, much of this is not at the forefront of my thoughts. It may be more of an anchor point in which I can still move within the ebb and flow of the tides of life that I encounter, whether glorious or in pain and suffering. Some of these waves pull very hard against this anchor, and that's okay. We may even think at times we have broken free of the anchor. We've lost ourselves in our pain and our suffering. But in the end, we can come to understand that it is God that holds on to us, and he will never let us go. We are anchored in him, by him, and through him. It is he who has taken on the responsibility to preserve our distinction, in fact. He simply invites us to participate in what he has preserved, no matter how much others may violate our distinction or we may violate our own distinction. He has our distinction well in hand. In fact, his seeming reluctance to engage with us from an external context declares it. His most intimate desire is to accomplish all things in us and through us, just as the Father, through Christ, has accomplished all things. Let me move on to some other areas to consider then, to address the source of suffering and pain that we encounter. There are two aspects here to consider. First is the suffering within the context of creation, but then also in the context of humanity. First, suffering within the context of creation. The pain and suffering caused within this context may actually be the simplest to explain. In that we know from the garden event, and more specifically when Adam and Eve ate the fruit from the forbidden tree, the earth was cast into an imbalance, and in that context began seeking equilibrium with itself. This is as a result, causes things like earthquakes, volcanoes, tornadoes, hurricanes, imbalances in rain and snow and weather, and causing crops to grow better at some times and not so well at others. All these different imbalances, some that cause positive effects that may be overwhelming to the earth in some ways, and then some that created lacking situations, but all of them in an imbalance. And in this, it seeks equilibrium with itself. So we also know that in the context of Eve, what is true in the heavenly realm was reflected in her. In fact, the pain and sorrow that became part of God birthing humanity from created into uncreated, into his uncreated spirit life, was reflected in Eve's physical womb. The things of the heavenly are reflected in recreation. So all things being created in the womb of God, to be born into the uncreated spirit life of God, were reflected now in Eve's womb. They are in union in some manner. So the pain and suffering that God now had to endure in birthing humanity into his life now became a part of her life. We know all things were created within God, but in some way this union with God affected the womb of God, which all things were created in. And so in that, it was reflected in the womb of the woman. It makes sense then that all of creation is in union with God and humanity in some manner. Thus, in the garden event, the fall of man has impacted creation and is reflected in the womb of the woman. In other words, as long as one human remains in creation, the issue with creation cannot be restored to its original design. In fact, until all humanity transfigures and ascends into the uncreated spirit life of God, the issue cannot be resolved. The earth will continue to remain in imbalance, trying to seek equilibrium. The only other alternative God had was to destroy humanity. Well, except that humanity was created in the relational image and relational likeness of God, and in destroying man, God would be violating his own sovereignty. For the sovereignty of God itself resides in relationship. Relational communion, relational union, relational distinction, all expressed through relational love, or what I call cuddle relationship. CUDL relationship. Communion, union, distinction, expressed in love. The sovereignty of God resides in this relationship, and to violate it, God would be violating his own sovereignty. So while the design of nature was created by God, the course of nature was redirected as a result of Adam and Eve eating from the forbidden tree. The natural being knocked out of balance and thus seeking equilibrium with itself, consuming itself in the process. Until the human condition is fully resolved through transfiguration and ascension, this imbalance will remain. God cannot fix it without destroying humanity or removing humanity from creation. He will do this through transfiguration and ascension. When we transfigure and ascend into the uncreated spirit realm of God, God will be able to fix it at that point. But it is not until then. So when he does fix it, this too will have its consequences. For in transfiguration and ascension, the propagation of humanity will cease. Let me repeat that. When humanity transfigures and ascends, propagation of humanity will receive. No more humans will have the opportunity to be included in the uncreated spirit life of God. Human production will cease. So God desires as many as possible to be included in his life, just as much as he desires that none should perish. and none will perish. And he will also include as many as possible in his life as well. There are bigger things going on here above and beyond our pain and suffering, no matter how bad our pain and suffering are. Our pain and suffering, in fact, are a testimony to how much God desires to include as many as possible in his uncreated life. Again, we are not diminishing the terrible experience of our pain and suffering. It can, in a very real sense, be unbearable. Most definitely, as seen in the cross event, in that Christ became our sin and took upon himself everything we ever did and had ever done to us. So every experience we ever experienced, he took upon himself while on the cross. In spite of knowing the cross event was coming, God went through with it and allowed himself to experience the pain and suffering of it. Our suffering will never compare to the combined suffering of everyone that has ever existed. This is the suffering that Christ endured on the cross on our behalf. And he thought humanity was still worth the effort. He has been to the deepest part of every human soul and experienced everything humanity has ever experienced. There was never a moment where he thought it was not worth it. But for the joy that was before him, he endured the cross. This is what we've been included in. Our life declares just how committed Christ is in including as many as possible in the uncreated life of God. You participate in this every time you suffer and experience pain. Your life testifies to the glory of what God is doing and accomplishing through your life of pain, sorrow, and suffering. He has not turned his back on what you are experiencing. He has done the opposite. He has embraced it. He embraced you in it. This is the testimony of our suffering and pain. God has included us in something way bigger than ourselves without losing us in the process. He has invited us to walk in it with him. He has committed his life to walk in it with you. Now I want to pause for a moment and make sure that we understand what I am not suggesting here. I am not suggesting that God allows pain and suffering in your life in order to benefit you personally. I am not suggesting that it cannot be beneficial